Right, hello and welcome back. For our next section of videos, we're going to be having a look at the next level, 001 blend modes. So here we're going to be having a look at the different ways we can make our material affect the world. Starting with opaque, and we're going to go through all of the different ones. Some of these are quite rare, some of them a bit more kind of advanced, but we'll cover them all here just sort of ease of completeness. But starting here with opaque, this is going to be the sort of most sort of fully featured one, covering most of the input pins. So to do this setup, I've used a lot of named reroute nodes. So we talked about them in previous video. It just means that we can keep things nice and clean. And I've also used a little bit of color coding as well. So anything that is a color, or 3 vector in this case, base color and emissive, I've colored green. Normals and well position offset I've done as blue, and anything else where it's just a single channel worth of data, these are in as red. And we'll go through each of these individually now as well. So these are the pins that are available to us as an opaque surface. Opaque is the default, and opaque is for anything that isn't translucent basically, so a solid object. So 90% of the things in your scene are probably going to be using opaque shaders, and this gives us full PBR workflow, so base color, normal, roughness, and then lighting calculations, and gives us a nice result. Cool, so I'm going to go through down each of the available input pins. Stuff that's grayed out is obviously available in other shading models, and we'll be covering those, in other blend modes, and we'll be covering those in other videos. And then obviously these are repeated. So base color, if we zoom out a bit, you can see I've got a nice stack of individual things, and each one just outputs to that named reroute node. Very nice way of keeping things nice and clean and contained, and neat, which we like. So base color, this is the unlit material color. What does that mean? Well, it's sometimes called albedo. We don't want shadows in here. If I go to the unlit view mode, you can see there's no shading information here. It's just the actual color of the surface. Used to be back when we used a lot more photo reference as textures, you would have what was called diffuse, and that would have sort of some shadowing in it, some bait lighting or some ambient occlusion or something like that. These days a lot of materials are made obviously with substance, or kind of built up from nothing rather than being a photo capture, and it's much easier to get this unlit material because we want the lighting to do our shading. There we are. Often just a single color as well. It's a full RGB input. I change that to green, okay, green. And it clamps at 1. So if I put in 5 in green, it doesn't get greener. It's as green as it can be. And we'll see when we do emissive, that's where we can use bigger numbers. So it's automatically clamping anything over 1 that gets put in. Moving down, second on the list is metallic. This controls how metallic the surface is. So actually this is quite a complicated input pin. I've made a note here, see the bonus video on metallic in PBR. Well, that's a reference to, this video that's on my YouTube channel. Go and check it out. Just a quick discussion about how PBR works and what metallic works with in the sort of real-time rendering in Unreal. Basically, as a sort of quick summary, metallic objects render completely differently to non-metallic objects. It's to do with physics and how light interacts with the sort of the molecules of the surface, and because of that we want to have 2 different renderers inside of a single renderer. So when we change this metallic to 1, we're now using a different render pipeline, and you can see here we're getting sort of this shiny surface. And it's to do with how the reflections and how the physical properties of light interact with the surface. What that sort of means in artistic terms is we get kind of coloured reflections and this darker surface as well. You can see there the difference between those two. There's a lot of discussion about whether you should use grey in your metallic maps. I very much think you should, and I explain it all in that video. Basically, it's an approximation, but everything we're doing is an approximation. We're not talking about, as good as PBR is, it's not physically accurate in the same way that light in the real world is, and so we always have to have some approximation somewhere. And so I'm firmly of the opinion, if it looks right, then it is right, and if that means that you're using 0.5 metallic, well, that's fine. That's the look you want. Yeah, where we might want to use a texture, if we've got some parts of material or the object that is metallic and some parts that aren't. So the front of these bricks now is metallic and the bits here aren't. We can use a texture for that as well. So depending on what kind of shader we're making. Often it's just a single value, or the default is 0. So if there's no input in here, then it's going to default to a metallic value of 0. So you don't need every pin to be connected all the time. Okay, worth noting that metallic will make something or will affect the reflections. It'll give us kind of colored reflections. That's to do with, again, how the physics of light interacts with our material. And we have a specular response here as well. Now specular does control the shininess, so low values will be less shiny and high values will be more shiny. But actually most surfaces do have a specular response of about 0.5. It's a quick typo there. Occasionally when you're dealing with things like water, you might want to lower the specular or up the specular slightly. But for most materials, we want to just leave the specular at the default of 0.5. If you've been doing game art a long time, we used to use a specular workflow. And again, that was one of the earlier approximations we made for optimization reasons. But these days, using PBR, we don't use specular to control our shininess or our reflections. Instead, we use roughness. And that's the next input here. So if I go to a roughness of 0, we get completely shiny, very, very reflective surface. Because now it's a sort of smooth kind of mirror polish finish. And the roughness of 1 is going to be completely matte, and we're not going to get any reflections whatsoever. If I take that metallic off, and there's our surface, very, very flat, and then with a bit of roughness down in here, going to go shiny. This sort of combination of base color, metallic if we're using a metal or not, and then roughness controls most of what you're seeing. That's the most important things there, plus the normal map, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, roughness is the most, or one of the most important parts of your material. Obviously can be used with the texture. If we change that to this green channel here, we'll get a controller with the roughness. Just open this and double check. So this is a channel pack texture. So this comes with the starter content. So I've used the green channel here, and actually that's incorrect. The way this has been channel packed, multiple different textures or multiple different maps have been put into different channels. This one here looks to me like roughness, and this one ambient occlusion, and we'll use that one in a bit. And then blue, I believe, is just a repetition of red. So if I go back to my material, let's put the red channel in, and there we are. Now we can see we get a nice bit of reflection or shininess happening on the bricks, but not on the grout, on the plasterwork in the middle. So personally, I like to put my roughness in the green channel. As I say, it's a very important part of the shader. The way textures are compressed, if we're using the default compression, the DXT1, there's a little bit more data in the green channel, and so our green channel is probably more important than our ambient occlusion, and so it makes more sense to put it in this the channel that has a little bit more compression, or a higher compression ratio, so a little bit more data. Cool. Again, if you want to know more about that, I did do a video on YouTube about compression textures and stuff, so you can check that out as well. Okay, moving down the list, anisotropy. What this means is when a surface has sort of lines on it, or striations, or a directional element to it, so brushed metal, some woods, some things like that, they have an anisotropic response, which means it's just different in different directions. Default value here is 0, and this will give us a square reflection. If I put this up to 1, you can see it's stretching that. Let's try a little bit lower than 1. Stretching that reflection along the horizontal direction. And if I put this to minus 0.85, it's going to be stretching it along the vertical direction. So brushed metals, this kind of thing, very useful. Hair has a very kind of, not that I have any, but hair has a very anisotropic response. And so, yeah, for these kinds of surfaces where the reflections do different things, you need to put in a positive or negative value. Cool. Keep moving down. Emissive. Emissive is another way of making or adding color to our material. Give it a sec to compile. Here I'm using a texture to mask it out, just multiplying those two together, and we have an emissive color. And here, as we can use values over 1. So if we want just a simple blue, well, values over 1 are going to now become bright and become emissive. Very cool. Since Unreal 5, with Lumen, you can use emissive materials as light sources. In previous versions, you had to bake. You could tell your emissive light source to sort of inject into the light baking, but now you can use emissive materials as dynamic lighting as well, which is a really nice feature. So really, really cool part of the updates in Unreal 5. I'm just going to unpick that for now, just because it's sort of a little bit garish and a little bit over the top. Next we have the normal map input. This is a this is a captured representation of the direction the light would bounce off the surface. So this technique is very powerful, gives us a really good result, but basically every single pixel, what's happening here is it takes the direction the light would have bounced off, and then encodes that. So we use high polys or a sculpt or something like that and capture that data and bring it in as a normal map. So you do a high to low poly bake and you get that information. But what's important is the information in this texture isn't rendered, it's not visible. What it is then directions, so different direction vectors per pixel. I will do there's going to be an additional video about that included, so I will do a whole breakdown of normal maps. What does that mean? Well, in practical terms, if we go into the detail lighting mode, that disables any of the diffuse colors. I don't think it disables emissive. No, it doesn't. But it disables any of the base color stuff up here. And we're now just seeing purely the lighting. And you can see we've got the surface being described by our normal map. If I unpin that, that's going to all go away. And now we're just seeing that roughness effect happening there. So all combines together. Normal maps, very, very powerful, really cheap way of getting a lot of appearance of lots of information into a model without having to have a million polygons, but doesn't give you nice edges. So here the silhouette should be kind of bumping in and out where the bricks are, and that won't have been done because it's just a surface effect basically. And we'll cover displacement and things later maybe that give us a bit more three dimension to things. Okay, fine. Moving on to world position offsets. We'll cover this in a lot more depth when we deal with the world position offset inputs in the math nodes, but effectively it just allows us to move our vertices. If I put a value of 5 in red, our sphere has moved 5 units horizontally. 50, there we are. It gets some self-shadowing issues here in the in this viewport. That wouldn't happen in the world. I think that's an approximation or a limitation of this little preview window. But this moving of an object via material is incredibly powerful. Any kind of cloth, hair again, foliage, all of that kind of stuff, water surfaces, anything that moves in a sort of repetitive and sort of subtle fashion can be done via world position offset shading. And we'll cover that in a future asset pack or future tutorial pack, not so much in this one, but I'm planning to do a whole another one where it's going to be more advanced than VFX type shaders. But we will cover it a little bit within other math nodes and things. So we set that back for now. There we go. Ambient occlusion. So this again is a texture. We saw it earlier in the green channel here. As light bounces around a room, a world, it's more likely to hit a flat surface. Here in sort of crevices is more likely to be shaded because of the close surfaces. And so what the ambient occlusion map does is represents that. So these darker sort of crevices here, the grouting between the bricks, is where less light is going to be bounced around, and so we get this ambient shade. Now the reason we do this as a separate texture is because it also combines with the direction or the direct light. So if you have an object that has a direct light source on it, then you don't want your ambient occlusion to be affecting there because it's already in direct light. And so, as I say, back in the day you'd bake your ambient occlusion into your base color map. But if I can find up here where the direct light is, there'll be less ambient occlusion here than there will back here, and so it's all part of that lighting calculation, and that's why it's done as a separate map here. Finally, one we use very occasionally, pixel depth offset. What this does is it moves the pixel being rendered towards the camera, and if we put a single value in here, again we get some self-shadowing errors, but effectively that sphere now is, rather than being where it appears to be, it's 50 units closer towards us, and then you can go and move closer, you'll move inside it. If we use a negative value, it should push back and then go behind the floor as well. There we go, minus 250, something like that. And you can kind of see that the clipping happening here is because the pixels have been pushed behind the camera. Not used very often. Some VFX things do this. You can do some blending between objects using pixel depth offset, and we'll cover that a little bit as well. But that's what that input does. Okay, so quite a big overview. A lot of these are either unnecessary or not used very often. So in this case here we've got everything connected, but actually pixel depth isn't very useful. We're not going to move this material. It's not emissive. We don't want to use anisotropy, and then metallic and specular. Don't want those either. Most of the time specular can stay at the default, and this is a non-metallic surface and the default for that is 0. So if I then clean this up, you can see actually most materials, or most opaque sort of surface environment materials, are going to be pretty simple. We're going to have a base color, a roughness, a normal, and then an ambient occlusion if you have one. So again, this is sort of optional. And there we are. Okay, that's everything for this video. We will go in and look at the more or the other blend modes one by one. Obviously, I'm not going to recover the same inputs, and if they're using the same input, generally it means it's the same thing in all but one case, I think. But yeah, we'll cover these in the next few videos.